In the gleaming towers of Manhattan's financial district, a brilliant analyst was about to face her biggest professional challenge. What started as a routine morning review took a shocking turn when she came face to face with a $30 million crisis. Sarah Mitchell wasn't your typical corporate employee. For 5 years, she had spent her career proving herself at Sterling and Associates, known for her methodical brilliance and quiet determination. When she discovered the massive data breach at 6:47 a.m., she had no idea she was walking into a battle that would test everything she believed about merit versus prejudice. Sarah's response would lead to a confrontation that would expose the true cost of institutional sexism. What began as a catastrophic security incident would become a defining moment of professional courage. The investment firm would never be the same after one woman chose competence over compliance, solutions over silence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The elevator's soft chime echoed through the empty 42nd floor of Sterling and Associates as Sarah Mitchell stepped into the pre-dawn silence. At 6:47 a.m., the Manhattan investment firm's offices held that peculiar stillness of a place waiting to explode into action. Sarah's heels clicked against polished marble as she made her way past darkened cubicles, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder with practiced efficiency. The morning ritual had become sacred to her. While colleagues rolled out of bed to catch trains, Sarah was already settling at her workstation with coffee, pulling up overnight market reports from Asia and Europe. These quiet moments belonged to her, a time when she could think clearly and prepare for whatever corporate chaos the day would bring. But this morning felt different. Her screens flickered to life in sequence: market data, client portfolios, overnight transaction logs. The familiar ritual should have been comforting, but something nagged at her as she scanned the overnight activity reports. The first anomaly appeared in the client database access logs. Sarah's trained eye caught it immediately, a pattern of queries that didn't match any authorized process she recognized. Her coffee grew cold as she leaned forward, fingers flying across the keyboard to dig deeper into the system logs. What, she found, made her stomach drop: unauthorized access attempts. Not the clumsy probing of amateur hackers, but sophisticated, methodical intrusions that had been happening for 3 days. Someone had been inside their systems, moving quietly through client databases, extracting information with surgical precision. The trading algorithms that represented years of proprietary development had been accessed. Portfolio data for their highest-profile clients, pension funds managing billions in retiree assets, had been copied. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she pulled up the extent of the breach. This wasn't just a security incident. This was a catastrophe that could destroy Sterling and Associates entirely. She reached for her phone and dialed David Park's extension, knowing he'd be in early, too. The IT security director answered on the first ring. "David, I need you up here immediately," Sarah said, her voice carefully controlled. "We have a problem." "How big a problem? Career ending? Company ending?" "Just get up here." Within minutes, David appeared at her workstation, his dark hair still damp from a morning run. Sarah had always appreciated his calm competence, a former cybersecurity specialist who'd left the military for corporate life, but retained the systematic thinking that made him invaluable during crises. "Show me," he said simply. Sarah walked him through her findings, watching his expression grow increasingly grim. David's fingers moved across his tablet, running diagnostic protocols as she explained the breach's scope. "This is sophisticated," David murmured. "Multi-vector attack, probably state-sponsored or organized crime level. They've been mapping our network architecture for months, waiting for the right moment to move." The weight of the discovery settled between them. Sarah found herself thinking about her parents back in Ohio, her father grading papers, her mother heading to her nursing shift. They'd been so proud when she'd landed this job, their daughter who'd earned a full scholarship to Northwestern, and an MBA from Wharton. The client list they accessed, Sarah said, pulling up another screen. Morrison Pension Fund, Teachers Retirement System, and at least 6 major institutional investors. If this gets out, it'll trigger a cascade of withdrawals that could collapse the firm, David finished, and lawsuits. Sarah's mind was already racing through implications and solutions. This was exactly the kind of crisis that separated competent analysts from true leaders. She'd spent 5 years proving herself at Sterling and Associates, watching less qualified men advance past her while she delivered exceptional results that were consistently undervalued. We need to assess the full damage, Sarah said, already pulling up additional reports. Client data exposure, algorithm theft, potential regulatory violations. And we need containment strategies before this spreads. David nodded, but she could see the concern in his eyes. Sarah, you know what happens when we report this upstairs. Sterling will take control, bring in his usual team. You'll be sidelined. The familiar frustration burned in Sarah's chest. Marcus Sterling, senior vice president and her direct supervisor, had a well-established pattern of marginalizing her contributions while taking credit for her insights. His old boys network approach prioritized optics over substance, politics over competence. But the evidence on her screen told a different story. This breach required someone who understood intricate technical details, someone who could think strategically about client relationships and regulatory responses. Maybe this time will be different, Sarah said, though her tone suggested she didn't believe it. David's expression softened. Over 2 years, their professional relationship had deepened into friendship. 2 competent people navigating a corporate culture that often valued connections over capability. You know it won't be, he said quietly. But that doesn't mean we can't be ready. Sarah saved her analysis and began printing key documents. The morning sun was beginning to penetrate the office's floor-to-ceiling windows. Soon, the building would fill with voices and activity, and this crisis would belong to everyone. She stood, straightening her blazer and gathering the printed reports. The morning's discovery had changed everything, but Sarah Mitchell had spent her entire career preparing for moments like this. Ready? David asked, closing his tablet. Sarah looked once more at her screens, at the evidence of sophisticated intrusion that threatened everything they'd built. In minutes, she'd walk into Marcus Sterling's office and watch him take control of her discovery. Let's go save the company, Sarah said, her voice carrying quiet determination. The morning's crisis would test whether merit could overcome prejudice when the stakes were highest. The elevator doors closed behind them as they headed toward a confrontation that would define not just the company's future, but Sarah's place within it. The elevator doors opened on the executive floor with a whisper, revealing Marcus Sterling's corner office through floor-to-ceiling glass walls. At IT 52, Marcus commanded the space like a man born to it, which Sarah reflected bitterly, he essentially had been. His father's portrait hung prominently behind an imposing mahogany desk, a constant reminder of the legacy connections that had secured Marcus's position despite his mediocre performance. Sarah knocked on the open door, her printed reports clutched in her hands. Marcus looked up from his phone, his expression already showing irritation at the interruption. Sarah, what's so urgent it couldn't wait until 9? His tone carried the familiar condescension she'd grown to expect. I have the Morrison Fund call in 20 minutes. That's exactly what this is about, Sarah said, stepping forward with David behind her. We've discovered a massive data breach, affecting Morrison and at least 5 other major clients. Someone has been inside our systems for 3 days. Marcus's expression shifted from annoyance to skepticism. He gestured dismissively at the chairs across from his desk. Sit. Walk me through this supposed crisis. Sarah spread her analysis. Across his desk, her voice steady and professional as she outlined the breach's scope. She detailed the unauthorized access patterns, the compromised trading algorithms, the stolen client data. Each point was supported by evidence, each conclusion backed by technical analysis that demonstrated both the sophistication of the attack and the catastrophic potential exposure. Marcus interrupted her midway through. "Sarah, slow down. You're getting hysterical about what's probably just a system glitch." The word hysterical hit her like a slap. Sarah felt David tense beside her, but she kept her voice level. "Marcus, this isn't a glitch. The evidence shows systematic intrusion across multiple databases. Our proprietary trading algorithms have been copied. Client portfolios worth billions. Enough." Marcus held up his hand. "David, what's your assessment?" David leaned forward, his military bearing evident as he spoke. "Sarah's analysis is accurate. This is a sophisticated, coordinated attack. The breach is extensive and poses immediate financial and legal risks." Marcus's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then at his watch. "Morrison's calling early." He answered without looking at either of them. "James, good to hear from you. Ready for our quarterly review?" Sarah watched in growing horror as Marcus's expression changed. The confident smile faded, replaced by confusion, then alarm. "What do you mean, unauthorized access?" "James, I think there's been some misunderstanding." Marcus's voice trailed off as he listened. His face paled. "A lawsuit? 30 million? James, let's not be hasty here." The call ended abruptly. Marcus stared at his phone, then at Sarah and David. "Morrison's threatening to sue for 30 million unless we resolve this immediately," he said, his voice hollow. "They've detected the breach from their end." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Before Sarah could respond, Marcus's assistant appeared in the doorway. "Sir, you have calls holding from Teachers Retirement and the Hendricks Foundation. They're asking about data security." The next hour unfolded like a nightmare Sarah had lived before, but never at this scale. Marcus's conference room filled with senior staff, all men, she noted, as he assembled what he called his crisis team. Sarah found herself relegated to a chair against the wall while Marcus held court at the head of the table. "Gentlemen, we're facing a potential catastrophe," Marcus announced, his voice regaining its commanding tone. "But I want everyone to remain calm. Panic leads to poor decisions." Sarah watched him present her findings as his own discovery, watched him minimize the technical complexity she'd spent hours analyzing. When David tried to provide additional technical context, Marcus cut him off. "Let's not get bogged down in IT jargon," Marcus said. "This is about damage control and client management." The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. Marcus was demonstrating exactly the kind of superficial thinking that had created vulnerabilities in the first place, while dismissing the deep technical understanding needed to solve them. When Tom Bradley, the junior analyst, tentatively raised his hand to share additional information he'd discovered, Marcus barely acknowledged him. "The junior staff can provide support," Marcus declared, "but this requires senior leadership." Then came the moment that crystallized everything Sarah had endured over 5 years at Sterling & Associates. "I know some of you might think we should involve our female colleagues more directly in this crisis," Marcus said, his eyes briefly meeting Sarah's. "But let's be realistic. Women simply can't handle this kind of pressure. They get emotional. They overthink problems instead of taking decisive action. What we need now is steady leadership." The room fell silent. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as every man in the room avoided eye contact. David's jaw clenched visibly, but he said nothing. "Sarah will coordinate support activities," Marcus continued smoothly. "Data compilation, documentation, that sort of thing. But the real decision-making needs to stay with people who can handle the heat." Sarah stood slowly, gathering her papers. Her voice, when she spoke, was deadly, calm. "Of course, Marcus. I'll coordinate support activities." She paused at the door. When you're ready for actual solutions instead of posturing, you know where to find me. The conference room door closed behind her with a soft click, sealing Sarah's fate. She was now officially sidelined from solving the crisis she'd discovered, dismissed by a man whose incompetence was matched only by his arrogance. But as she walked back to her desk, Sarah's mind was already working. Marcus had just made a catastrophic mistake. While he played politics in his conference room, she would do what she did best, find solutions. And when his inevitable failure became apparent, she'd be ready to save the company despite him. The real battle was just beginning. Sarah's hands moved across her keyboard with methodical precision. Her cubicle transformed into a command center that Marcus Sterling's conference room could never match. While the official crisis team debated optics and damage control 40 feet away, she was building something far more substantial, an actual solution. The morning sun cast sharp angles through the office windows as Sarah pulled up network, diagnostics, client communication protocols, and regulatory compliance frameworks. Her screens displayed a complexity that Marcus's team couldn't comprehend, let alone address. Every few minutes, muffled voices from the conference room confirmed what she'd suspected. They were floundering. David appeared at her cubicle, moving, with the careful casualness of someone trying not to draw attention. He leaned against her desk partition, his voice low. "Sterling's having them cold call clients without any technical understanding of what happened," he murmured. "Johnson just told Morrison that their data was temporarily inaccessible due to routine maintenance issues." Sarah winced. "That's going to make everything worse. When clients realize they've been lied to, it gets worse. They're proposing to hire an external crisis management firm instead of addressing the actual security breach. Sterling thinks this is a public relations problem." The familiar frustration burned in Sarah's chest, but she channeled it into focus. Her screens showed the comprehensive solution taking shape. Technical containment protocols, client communication strategies that emphasized transparency and accountability, legal frameworks that could minimize liability while maintaining trust. "How long before they realize their approach isn't working?" Sarah asked, not looking up from her analysis. "Based on the shouting I'm hearing, maybe an hour." Tom Bradley materialized beside David, his young face creased with worry. At 24, the junior analyst still possessed the idealism that corporate politics hadn't yet crushed. He glanced nervously toward the conference room before speaking. "Sarah, I need to tell you something about the breach." She looked up from her screens, noting the tension in Tom's voice. "What is it?" Tom pulled up a chair, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I was running routine security audits last month, part of my training rotation. I found vulnerabilities in the client database architecture, multiple entry points that should have been patched." Sarah's attention sharpened. "Did you report them?" "I tried. I sent a memo to Sterling's office about the security gaps, recommended immediate patches and system updates." Tom's face reddened. He never responded. When I followed up, his assistant said budget constraints meant all non-essential. IT expenses were frozen until next quarter. David leaned forward. "You're saying this breach was preventable?" "Completely preventable. The vulnerabilities I identified are exactly what the attackers exploited. If Sterling had authorized the patches, maybe $8,000 in security updates, none of this would have happened." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Do you still have the documentation?" Tom nodded, pulling out his tablet. "Everything. The vulnerability assessment, the cost analysis, the implementation timeline. I even included references to similar attacks on other firms." He hesitated. "There's more. Sterling's assistant told me he was specifically cutting IT security costs to boost quarterly profit margins. Said he needed the numbers to look good for the board review." The implications crashed over Sarah like a wave. Marcus hadn't just failed to prevent the crisis. his penny pinching had directly caused it. While he sat in his conference room pontificating about leadership and pressure, his own decisions had created the vulnerability that now threatened to destroy the company. "Tom, this changes everything," Sarah said quietly. "This isn't just about solving the immediate crisis. This is about accountability for decisions that endangered every client we serve." David's expression had hardened. The military calls this criminal negligence. In the corporate world, it's probably just poor judgment that gets overlooked if the crisis gets resolved quietly. Sarah's mind was racing through implications and possibilities. The evidence Tom had uncovered didn't just exonerate the firm. It could shift all liability to individual negligence. But using it would mean exposing Marcus's role in creating the crisis, potentially destroying his career while saving the company. "Where's Elena Rodriguez?" Sarah asked suddenly. The chief operating officer was the only woman in senior leadership, and the only executive Sarah trusted to handle this complexity with actual wisdom. "Conference in Singapore," David replied. "Won't be back until tomorrow morning." Sarah stared at her screens, processing the weight of what she now knew. She possessed not just the technical solution to the crisis, but evidence that could completely change its resolution. The question was whether she had the courage to use it. "What do we do?" Tom asked, his voice barely audible. Sarah saved her work and turned to face them both. "We do what Sterling can't. We solve the actual problem. All of it." Her voice carried a determination that made both men straighten. "David, I need you to validate my technical solutions. Tom, I need you to document everything you've told me, with timestamps and evidence. And both of you need to understand, what we're about to do could end all our careers." "Or save the company," David said quietly. "Or both," Sarah replied, turning back to her keyboard. The underground alliance was formed. Now the real work could begin. In the conference room, Marcus Sterling's voice rose in frustration as another client call went badly. But 40 feet away, the person who could actually solve his crisis was building something he'd never understand, a solution based on competence, integrity, and the courage to tell the truth. The morning was far from over. By 10:30 a.m., the cacophony from Marcus Sterling's conference room had reached a fever pitch. Through the glass walls, Sarah could see gesticulating figures, scattered papers, and the unmistakable body language of a team in complete disarray. The irony wasn't lost on her. While they debated who to blame for the crisis, the actual perpetrators were probably already monetizing the stolen data. Meanwhile, her cubicle had become the nerve center of what would actually save Sterling and Associates, if anyone would listen. Sarah's comprehensive solution sprawled across 3 monitors: technical breach containment protocols on the left, client communication strategies in the center, and legal liability frameworks on the right. Each component was meticulously detailed, cross-referenced, and designed to work in concert. This wasn't the superficial damage control Marcus favored. This was systematic crisis resolution. David returned from another reconnaissance mission to the conference room, his expression grim. They just lost Hendricks Foundation. Johnson told them their data was completely secure right before their IT team detected unauthorized access from their own monitoring systems. "That's 4 major clients threatening lawsuits now," Sarah said, not looking up from her legal analysis. "What's Sterling's response?" "Blame the IT department for not detecting the breach sooner. He's demanding to know why you didn't catch this 3 days ago." Sarah's fingers paused on the keyboard. The irony was breathtaking. Marcus was criticizing her for not discovering a breach that his cost-cutting had made inevitable, while simultaneously excluding her from developing solutions. Tom approached with fresh printouts, his face pale. "Sarah, I found more evidence. Sterling didn't just ignore the security recommendations. He explicitly overruled them. Look at this email chain." Sarah read the documents Tom had uncovered, her jaw tightening with each line. Marcus had received 3 separate warnings about the security vulnerabilities, each more urgent than the last. His responses showed a pattern of dismissing technical concerns while prioritizing short-term profit margins. One email was particularly damning. He'd written to the IT budget committee that theoretical security risks shouldn't interfere with real business priorities. "This isn't just negligence," Sarah murmured. "This is willful endangerment of client assets." Her phone buzzed with a text from David. "Client call from teacher's retirement going badly. Sterling just promised them full resolution within hours with no plan to deliver. Also just overheard him telling legal he wants all technical details. Kept confidential to prevent panic." Sarah shook her head in disbelief. Marcus was making promises he couldn't keep while simultaneously ensuring he couldn't develop the competence to keep them. Her solution could genuinely resolve the crisis, but it required immediate action and transparency that Marcus's approach actively opposed. While he made impossible promises to buy time, she'd developed actual methods to deliver results. The technical component of her plan was elegant in its comprehensiveness. Rather than the piecemeal patches Marcus's team was attempting, Sarah had designed a complete system-hardening protocol that would not only close existing vulnerabilities, but prevent similar attacks in the future. It would take 6 hours to implement, but it would work. Her client communication strategy addressed the trust deficit that Marcus's lies had created. Instead of minimizing the breach, her approach acknowledged its severity while demonstrating competence through detailed explanation of resolution steps. She'd crafted individual messages for each affected client, addressing their specific concerns and providing concrete timelines for security restoration. The legal framework was perhaps most crucial. Sarah had identified precedents where transparent, proactive crisis management had minimized liability even in severe breaches. Companies that acknowledged problems quickly and demonstrated competent solutions often emerged stronger than those that attempted cover-ups. But implementing her solution meant defying Marcus directly. It meant contacting clients without authorization, revealing technical details he wanted suppressed, and potentially exposing his role in creating the crisis. "Sarah," Tom said quietly, "there's something else. I overheard Sterling on a call with legal counsel. He's planning to blame the entire breach on inadequate security protocols implemented by junior staff." The words hit Sarah like ice water. Marcus wasn't just excluding her from the solution. He was preparing to make her the scapegoat for his failures. David's voice carried quiet fury when he spoke. "He's going to destroy your career to save his own." Sarah stared at her screens, at the comprehensive solution that could save the company and restore client confidence. She thought about her parents in Ohio, about the 5 years she'd spent proving herself, about every promotion denied and every contribution dismissed. Then she thought about the pension funds threatened by Marcus's incompetence, teachers, nurses, firefighters, people whose retirements depended on the financial security that Marcus's ego was now endangering. "Not if I save the company first," Sarah said, her voice carrying steel. She pulled up her client contact list and began entering phone numbers. "David, start implementing the technical protocols. Tom, prepare all documentation about the preventable vulnerabilities." "Sarah, what are you doing?" Tom asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "Something Marcus will never forgive me for," she replied, reaching for her phone. "I'm solving the actual problem." Her finger hovered over James Whitmore's direct number. Once she made this call, there would be no going back. She would be in open rebellion against her supervisor, risking everything on her conviction that competence should matter more than hierarchy. But as another shout erupted from the conference room, Sarah realized the choice had already been made. For her, Marcus's approach was failing catastrophically, and someone had to act before his incompetence destroyed everything. She dialed the number and waited for Whitmore to answer. The real crisis management was about to begin. James Whitmore's voice crackled through Sarah's phone with the fury of a man watching his professional reputation crumble in real time. "Ms. Mitchell, I've been trying to get straight answers from your people for 2 hours. All I'm getting is corporate doublespeak and promises that mean nothing." Sarah took a steadying breath, knowing that the next few minutes would either save Sterling and Associates or end her career. Behind her, she could hear Marcus Sterling's voice rising in the conference room as another client call went disastrously wrong. "Mr. Whitmore, I understand your frustration. I'm calling because you deserve the truth about what happened and a real plan to fix it." There was a pause. When Whitmore spoke again, his tone had shifted slightly. "You're not the idiot who's been feeding me lies about routine maintenance, are you?" "No, sir. I'm the analyst who discovered the breach, and I have solutions, not excuses." For the next 20 minutes, Sarah walked James Whitmore through the technical reality of the attack, its scope, its sophistication, and most importantly, her comprehensive plan to contain it. She explained the exact vulnerabilities that had been exploited, the timeline for closing them, and the multi-layered security protocols that would prevent future incidents. "This is the first conversation I've had today that makes any sense," Whitmore said finally. "You're telling me you can have our systems secured and our data protected within 6 hours?" "Completely secured, with full audit trails and verification. Protocols. You'll have documentation of every step we take and independent confirmation that the vulnerabilities have been eliminated." "And what about the idiots who've been lying to me all morning?" Sarah hesitated. This was the moment that would define everything. "Mr. Whitmore, my focus is on solving the problem and protecting your assets. The accountability questions will have to be addressed separately." "Fair enough. When can you start?" "I'm starting now." As Sarah ended the call, she felt a mixture of exhilaration and terror. She'd just committed to a solution that required immediate implementation, complete transparency, and technical execution that Marcus's team couldn't even comprehend. But Whitmore's response told her everything she needed to know. Competence and honesty resonated even when hierarchy and politics failed. David appeared at her workstation, his laptop open and security protocols ready. "How did it go?" "He's on board." "What's our status on technical implementation?" "Ready to execute. I've been running background diagnostics for the past hour. The vulnerabilities are exactly where Tom said they'd be, and I've got patches ready for deployment." Sarah's phone rang again, teacher's retirement system, then Morrison Fund. Within an hour, she'd spoken directly with 5 major clients, each conversation following the same pattern. Initial skepticism melted into relief as she demonstrated actual understanding of their concerns and provided concrete solutions with specific timelines. The transformation was remarkable. Clients who'd been threatening immediate lawsuits began expressing cautious optimism. Fund managers who'd been preparing to pull their investments started asking about strengthened security protocols going forward. But Sarah's unauthorized success couldn't remain hidden forever. "Mitchell!" Marcus Sterling's voice cut across the office like a blade. "My office. Now." The conference room had emptied, leaving only Marcus and 2 senior partners. Their faces showed a mixture of confusion and fury that made Sarah's stomach clench. But she walked into that office with her head high, carrying printouts of client confirmations and technical implementation schedules. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Marcus's face was red with rage. "I've had 3 clients call me in the past hour asking why my junior analyst knows more about this crisis than my entire senior team." "I've been doing what you asked," Sarah replied evenly. "Solving the problem. I asked you to provide support, not to undermine my authority by making unauthorized client contact. Your authority wasn't solving the crisis, Marcus. Your approach was making it worse." The temperature in the room dropped perceptibly. One of the senior partners shifted uncomfortably, but Marcus's eyes narrowed with dangerous intent. "You've just committed career suicide, Mitchell. Insubordination, violation of protocol, Unauthorized client communication. I have grounds to fire you immediately and ensure you never work in this industry again. Sarah felt her heart pounding, but her voice remained steady. Fire the person who just prevented 4 major lawsuits and restored client confidence? The person who has actual solutions while your team creates bigger problems with every phone call? Solutions? Marcus laughed harshly. You've created a bigger mess by going around me. These clients will lose confidence in our management structure if they think junior staff can bypass proper channels. No, Marcus. They've gained confidence because someone finally treated them with honesty and competence instead of condescension and lies. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah could see Marcus processing the implications. His leadership had been publicly bypassed by a subordinate who'd achieved better results in 1 hour than his team had managed all morning. You're finished here, Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the promise of professional destruction. But before Sarah could respond, Marcus's assistant appeared in the doorway, her face flushed with excitement. Mr. Sterling, Elena Rodriguez is on line 1. She's calling from Singapore, and she says it's urgent regarding the crisis management. Sarah felt a surge of hope. Elena Rodriguez, the chief operating officer, the only woman in senior leadership, and the only executive with both the authority and wisdom to see past Marcus's ego to the actual solutions. The power dynamics were about to shift again, and this time, competence might finally matter more than hierarchy. Marcus reached for his phone, but Sarah could see the uncertainty in his eyes. Elena's return meant his failures would be evaluated by someone who valued results over politics. The real test was just beginning. Elena Rodriguez's voice carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to cutting through corporate chaos to reach actual facts. Even through the phone's speaker, her presence filled Marcus Sterling's office with a gravity that shifted everyone's posture. Marcus, I've been getting calls from clients for the past hour. Morrison Fund, Teachers Retirement, Hendricks Foundation, all telling me that someone named Sarah Mitchell has provided them with the first competent crisis management they've received all day. Would you care to explain why a senior analyst is apparently running our crisis response? Marcus's face cycled through several shades of red as he glanced at Sarah, who remained standing near his desk. The 2 senior partners exchanged looks that suggested they were rapidly recalculating their positions. Elena, there's been some confusion about proper protocols, Marcus began, his voice carefully modulated. Ms. Mitchell took unauthorized action that could have serious implications for our management structure. Unauthorized action that resulted in retaining 4 major clients who were threatening immediate withdrawal? Elena's tone sharpened. Marcus, I need to understand exactly what's happening. I'm cutting my conference short and flying back tonight, but I need a full briefing now. Sarah watched Marcus struggle with how to frame the situation without revealing his own failures. But Elena Rodriguez hadn't become chief operating officer by accepting incomplete information. I want to speak with Ms. Mitchell directly, Elena continued. Put her on the line. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he had no choice. He gestured for Sarah to take the phone, his eyes promising future retribution. Ms. Rodriguez, this is Sarah Mitchell. Sarah, I need you to walk me through exactly what happened today from the beginning. Don't worry about whose feelings might get hurt. I need facts. For the next 15 minutes, Sarah provided a comprehensive briefing that was both diplomatic and devastatingly thorough. She outlined her discovery of the breach, her analysis of its scope, her development of comprehensive solutions, and the results of her direct client outreach. She carefully avoided directly criticizing Marcus while allowing the facts to speak for themselves. Elena's questions were incisive and revealed both her technical understanding and her political acumen. She probed the timeline, the technical specifications, the client responses, and the organizational dynamics that had led to Sarah's unauthorized action. And what's the current status of implementation? Elena asked. Technical containment is 70% complete. client communication has restored confidence with all major accounts contacted. Legal exposure has been reduced from approximately 50 million to less than 5 million through proactive transparency and competent response protocols. Silence filled the office. Even Marcus seemed to grasp the magnitude of what Sarah had accomplished in a few hours. "Marcus," Elena said finally, "I need to speak with you privately. Sarah, please wait outside." Sarah left the office but remained, close enough to hear Elena's voice through the glass walls. The conversation was intense but brief. Through the windows, she could see Marcus's expression growing increasingly desperate as Elena spoke. Tom Bradley appeared beside her, carrying additional documentation. "Sarah, I think you should see this. I found more emails about the security budget cuts. Elena's assistant asked me to compile everything for her review." David joined them, his laptop showing completed technical protocols. "First phase of system hardening is complete. All critical vulnerabilities have been patched, and I'm running verification protocols now." The office door opened, and Elena's voice emerged clearly. "Sarah, please come back in." When Sarah entered, the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. Marcus sat behind his desk looking deflated, while Elena's voice carried the unmistakable tone of executive decision-making. "Sarah, based on what I've learned in the past 20 minutes, I'm making several immediate changes to our crisis management structure. First, you're being placed in charge of all technical and client communication aspects of this crisis, effective immediately." Sarah felt her heart rate spike, but kept her expression neutral. "Second, Marcus will focus on internal coordination and regulatory compliance, working under your technical guidance." Marcus's face had gone pale, but he said nothing. "Third, I want a complete post-crisis analysis of the security vulnerabilities and budget decisions that led to this breach. Tom Bradley will lead that investigation, reporting directly to me." Elena paused, her tone softening slightly. "Sarah, you've demonstrated exceptional competence under pressure and the moral courage to act when action was needed. However, the way you had to act, bypassing your supervisor, risking your career, suggests serious problems with our organizational culture that I intend to address." Sarah found her voice. "Thank you, Ms. Rodriguez. I'll ensure the technical implementation is completed flawlessly." "I know you will. Marcus, I expect your full cooperation in this transition. The board will be very interested in understanding how this crisis developed and how it was resolved." As Elena ended the call, the office fell into uncomfortable silence. Marcus stared at his desk, processing the reality that his authority had been not just undermined but officially transferred to the woman he'd dismissed and humiliated. Sarah straightened her shoulders, feeling the weight of official responsibility settling onto them. The immediate crisis was being resolved, but she now faced the larger challenge of leading while navigating the political complexities Elena had acknowledged. "David, Tom," she said, her voice carrying new authority. "Let's complete the implementation. We have work to do." As they left Marcus's office, Sarah realized that the morning's crisis had accomplished something she'd never imagined possible. It had forced competence to triumph over prejudice, at least temporarily. The real test would be whether that change could become permanent. The power had shifted, but the hardest work was just beginning. With Elena Rodriguez's official backing, Sarah's cubicle transformed into a legitimate command center. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows as she coordinated the most complex crisis response in Sterling and Associates history, her 3 monitors displaying real-time security implementations, client communications, and legal compliance frameworks. The technical containment was proceeding flawlessly. David's systematic approach to closing vulnerabilities had restored system integrity while maintaining operational continuity. Each completed protocol was verified by independent security audits, creating an unassailable record of competent crisis management. "All critical vulnerabilities sealed," David reported, his voice carrying satisfaction mixed with exhaustion. "Running final penetration tests now, but the system architecture is more secure than it was before the attack." Sarah nodded, pulling up her client communication dashboard. The transformation in client confidence was remarkable. Fund managers who'd threatened immediate withdrawal were now asking about enhanced security protocols for future investments. Her transparency strategy had converted a catastrophic trust breach into an opportunity to demonstrate Sterling and Associates' commitment to protecting client assets. But as the immediate crisis stabilized, Tom Bradley's investigation into the breach's preventable nature was revealing increasingly disturbing evidence of institutional negligence. "Sarah, you need to see this," Tom said, approaching with a thick folder of documentation. His usual nervous energy had been replaced by something approaching moral outrage. The security vulnerabilities weren't just ignored. They were actively deprioritized in favor of quarterly profit optimization. Sarah reviewed the documents Tom had compiled, her expression growing increasingly grim. The evidence painted a picture of systematic risk management failure that went beyond Marcus's individual decisions to reveal broader cultural problems within the firm's leadership. The security budget cuts hadn't been isolated decisions, but part of a coordinated strategy to inflate short-term profits at the expense of long-term stability. Multiple departments had raised concerns about aging infrastructure, inadequate cybersecurity protocols, and insufficient staff training, only to be overruled by executive decisions that prioritized immediate financial metrics over prudent risk management. This isn't just about Marcus, Sarah realized, scanning through email chains that implicated several senior executives. This is about a management philosophy that treated security as an expense rather than an investment. Tom's voice dropped to a whisper. "It gets worse. I found evidence that similar warnings were raised 6 months ago by the compliance department. They specifically flagged our vulnerability to the type of attack we just experienced." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. The breach hadn't been an unforeseeable attack by sophisticated criminals. It had been a predictable consequence of decisions that prioritized short-term profits over fiduciary responsibility to clients. Her phone buzzed with a text from Elena. "Rodriguez. Regulatory investigators want full briefing tomorrow morning. Need complete timeline and accountability assessment." The implications crashed over Sarah like a wave. The evidence Tom had uncovered could shift all legal liability from corporate responsibility to individual negligence, potentially saving Sterling and Associates from catastrophic lawsuits while exposing specific executives to criminal charges. David appeared at her workstation, his expression troubled. "Sarah, the technical audit is revealing something else. The attackers didn't just exploit known vulnerabilities. They had detailed knowledge of our internal security protocols. This might have been an inside job." "What do you mean?" "The attack patterns suggest someone with administrative access provided reconnaissance. The breach was too targeted, too efficient for external hackers working blind." Sarah stared at the evidence accumulating before her. What had begun as a crisis requiring technical solutions was evolving into something far more complex: potential criminal conspiracy involving internal actors and executive negligence that could destroy careers and trigger federal investigations. Her phone rang. Elena Rodriguez, calling from her flight back to New York. "Sarah, I've been thinking about our conversation and the broader implications of this crisis. Tomorrow's regulatory briefing isn't just about resolving the immediate situation. It's about determining whether Sterling and Associates can continue to exist as a trustworthy institution. I understand the stakes, Ms. Rodriguez." "I don't think you do. The evidence you've uncovered suggests systematic failures that could trigger a federal investigation. If we handle this wrong, we're not just facing lawsuits. We're facing potential criminal charges for fiduciary negligence." Sarah's grip tightened on the phone. "What are you asking me to do?" "I'm asking you to make the hardest decision of your career. You have evidence that could completely exonerate the company by shifting all blame to individual executives. You could save Sterling and Associates and advance your own career by exposing the negligence of people who've marginalized and dismissed you. The silence stretched between them before Elena continued. Or you could find a more complex solution that serves justice while preserving the institution that employs thousands of people and manages billions in retirement assets. Sarah looked around the office, at David implementing security protocols, at Tom documenting evidence of institutional failure, at the trading floor below where hundreds of employees worked in ignorance of how close their company had come to collapse. The regulatory briefing is at 9 a.m., Elena said. Your testimony will determine not just how this crisis is resolved, but what kind of leader you choose to become. The line went dead, leaving Sarah alone with the weight of absolute, moral complexity. She possessed the power to destroy those who had dismissed her while saving the company they had endangered. But wielding that power would require her to become someone she'd never been, someone willing to use others' failures for personal advancement. The technical crisis was solved, but the moral crisis was just beginning. The evening lights of Manhattan cast long shadows through Sarah's office windows as she sat alone with the most consequential decision of her career spread across her desk. The technical crisis had been resolved with mathematical precision, system vulnerabilities eliminated, client confidence restored, legal exposure minimized. But the moral crisis that remained defied such clear solutions. Tom's investigation lay before her in damning detail. Email chains proving Marcus had ignored multiple security warnings, budget documents showing his systematic prioritization of profits over protection, and most devastating of all, evidence suggesting he had actively suppressed information about vulnerabilities to hide his own budget overruns from senior management. The legal implications were staggering. Sterling and Associates' general counsel had called an hour earlier to explain that Tom's evidence could shift liability entirely from corporate responsibility to individual negligence. Instead of facing $50 million in institutional lawsuits, the company could emerge as a victim of executive malfeasance, with Marcus and potentially other senior leaders facing criminal charges for fiduciary negligence. The board would be grateful beyond measure, the attorney had said carefully. This evidence could save the company and everyone's jobs. It would also position you as the hero who not only solved the crisis, but exposed the root causes. Sarah stared at Marcus's office across the floor, where he sat hunched over his desk, probably preparing his own version of events for tomorrow's regulatory hearing. The man who had dismissed her capabilities, marginalized her contributions, and planned to scapegoat her for his failures now faced potential career destruction through evidence she controlled. The poetic justice was almost too perfect. After 5 years of watching less qualified men advance past her, of having her insights appropriated and her competence questioned, she finally possessed the power to demonstrate definitively that merit mattered more than gender, that competence trumped connections. But victory achieved through others' destruction felt hollow in ways she hadn't expected. David appeared in her doorway, carrying coffee and the weary expression of someone who'd spent the day rebuilding security infrastructure from the ground up. Technical implementation is complete, he said, settling into a chair across from her desk. Every vulnerability closed, every system hardened, every protocol verified. We've transformed this crisis into the most comprehensive security upgrade in the company's history. And Tom's investigation? David's expression grew troubled. Conclusive. Marcus didn't just ignore warnings, he actively suppressed them. The evidence is solid enough for criminal prosecution. Sarah leaned back in her chair, processing the weight of absolute moral complexity. David, what would you do? If you had the power to destroy someone who'd systematically undermined you while saving an institution that employs thousands of innocent people? David was quiet for a long moment, his military background evident in his careful consideration. In the service, we had a saying, mission first, people always. The mission was protecting the country, but you never accomplished it by destroying good people unnecessarily. Marcus isn't a good person. No, but the question isn't whether he deserves destruction. The question is whether destroying him serves justice or just serves your anger. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Elena Rodriguez. Flight delayed. Regulatory hearing moved to 10 a.m. Use the extra time wisely. The reprieve felt more like additional pressure. Sarah pulled up her computer and began drafting her testimony for the regulatory hearing, trying to find language that served truth without serving vengeance. The first draft was devastating, a systematic exposure of Marcus's negligence that would certainly result in his termination and potential prosecution. The evidence was irrefutable, the conclusions inescapable. It would save Sterling and Associates while positioning Sarah as the competent leader who'd emerged from institutional failure. But as she reviewed the draft, Sarah found herself thinking about the pension funds she'd saved, the retirement assets she'd protected, the institutional trust she'd restored. Her success hadn't come from destroying others. It had come from building solutions that served something larger than personal advancement. She deleted the draft and started again. The second version was more complex, acknowledging institutional failures without targeting individuals, demonstrating systematic problems without assigning criminal blame, showing how competent crisis management could emerge from organizational dysfunction without destroying those who'd created that dysfunction. But this approach carried risks. Without clear scapegoats, the regulatory investigators might dig deeper, potentially uncovering other institutional problems that could threaten the company's survival. Protecting Marcus might ultimately harm the very institution she was trying to save. Tom appeared in her doorway, his face showing the exhaustion of someone who'd spent the day documenting institutional failure. Sarah, I've been thinking about tomorrow's hearing. The evidence I've compiled, it's powerful enough to change everything. But using it feels like... He struggled for words. Like becoming the kind of person who uses others' failures for personal advancement. Sarah looked at him, seeing in his young face the idealism she'd once possessed before 5 years of corporate politics had taught her pragmatism. What if justice and pragmatism don't align? She asked. What if doing right requires choices that aren't clearly right or wrong? Tom sat down, his voice carrying surprising wisdom. Maybe that's when character matters most, when the easy answers don't exist. Sarah stared at her computer screen, at the cursor blinking in an empty document that would determine not just how this crisis ended, but what kind of leader she would become. Tomorrow's testimony would define whether she was someone who used power to settle scores or someone who used power to serve principles. The choice would determine not just Marcus's fate, but her own moral future. Outside her window, the city hummed with the energy of millions of people making decisions that shaped their character one choice at a time. Tomorrow, it would be her turn. The federal building's conference room carried the weight of institutional authority, polished mahogany, American flags, and the unmistakable atmosphere of a place where careers lived or died based on the accuracy of sworn statements. Sarah Mitchell sat at the witness table, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to decide. 3 financial regulators faced her across the table, their expressions neutral but intent. To her left sat Sterling and Associates, legal counsel, whose nervous energy suggested he understood that the next hour would determine the firm's survival. Behind her, Elena Rodriguez observed with the focused attention of someone whose own career hung in the balance. Marcus Sterling sat in the back row, his usual confidence replaced by the hollow expression of a man watching his professional world crumble. Tom Bradley and David Park flanked him, their presence serving as living reminders of the evidence that could destroy him completely. Ms. Mitchell, began Regulatory Director Janet Chen, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to extracting truth from corporate evasion. You've been sworn in to provide testimony regarding the data breach at Sterling and Associates, your role in its resolution, and any relevant information about its causes." Sarah's mouth felt dry despite the water glass before her. Her prepared testimony, revised 3 times during a sleepless night, represented a path between justice and vengeance that she hoped would serve principles larger than personal satisfaction. "Thank you, Director Chen. I discovered the breach at approximately 6:47 a.m. yesterday morning during routine system monitoring. The attack was sophisticated, targeting specific client databases and proprietary trading algorithms." For the next 20 minutes, Sarah provided comprehensive technical testimony about the breach's scope, the attacker's methods, and her systematic approach to containment. The regulator's questions were precise, probing for weaknesses in Sterling and Associates' security protocols and response procedures. "Your technical solutions appear exemplary," noted Regulator Morrison, reviewing her documentation. "Can you explain why the initial institutional response was apparently inadequate?" This was the moment Sarah had dreaded and anticipated. The question that would determine whether she used her knowledge to serve justice or vengeance. The initial response reflected institutional priorities that emphasized public relations over technical accuracy, Sarah said carefully. There was concern about managing client perceptions rather than addressing underlying security vulnerabilities. "Were you aware of any prior warnings about these vulnerabilities?" Sarah felt the room's attention sharpen. In the back, Marcus, Sterling's face had gone pale. This was the moment when Tom's evidence could destroy him completely. "Yes, ma'am. Security assessments had identified potential vulnerabilities in our client database architecture. However, the organizational response to these warnings reflected broader institutional challenges regarding resource allocation and risk assessment priorities." Director Chen leaned forward. "Ms. Mitchell, are you suggesting that this breach was preventable?" "Yes, ma'am. With appropriate security investments and systematic vulnerability patching, this type of attack could have been prevented entirely." "And why weren't those investments made?" Sarah paused, feeling the weight of absolute choice. She could provide Tom's documentation, expose Marcus's specific decisions, and shift all blame to individual negligence. It would save the company while destroying the man who had dismissed and marginalized her. Instead, she chose a different path. The decisions reflected institutional culture that prioritized short-term financial metrics over long-term security investments. This wasn't the failure of any single individual, but rather a systematic prioritization of quarterly profits over prudent risk management. The room was silent. Sarah could feel Elena Rodriguez's surprise, Marcus Sterling's confusion, and the regulator's recognition that she was providing institutional analysis rather than individual blame. "Ms. Mitchell," Director Chen continued, "do you have evidence of specific decision-makers who ignored security recommendations?" "I have evidence of systemic institutional failures that created vulnerabilities. However, I believe the most constructive approach is focusing on implementing comprehensive security reforms rather than assigning individual blame for past decisions." Regulator Morrison shuffled through his papers. "That's an unusual perspective. Most witnesses in your position would be eager to identify specific culprits." Sarah looked directly at him. "My priority is ensuring this never happens again to any client whose retirement security depends on our competence. That requires institutional reform, not individual scapegoating." For the next hour, Sarah's testimony focused on systematic improvements, enhanced security protocols, regular vulnerability assessments, transparent client communication standards, and oversight mechanisms that would prevent future crises. She provided detailed recommendations that demonstrated her expertise while avoiding the personal destruction that would have satisfied her anger but not served broader justice. When the hearing concluded, Sarah felt simultaneously drained and oddly peaceful. She'd chosen to use her power to build rather than destroy, to serve principles rather than personal vindication. Outside the conference room, Marcus Sterling approached her, his expression showing confusion mixed with something approaching gratitude. "Sarah, I don't understand why you didn't expose everything. You had every reason to destroy me." Sarah looked at him steadily. "Because destroying you wouldn't have served the people whose retirement funds were supposed to protect. They needed solutions, not revenge." Elena Rodriguez appeared beside them, her expression showing respect mixed with curiosity. "That was either the most principled testimony I've ever heard, or the most politically sophisticated." "Maybe both," Sarah replied. "The question is whether Sterling and Associates will implement the reforms necessary to deserve the second chance we just received." As they walked from the federal building into the bright morning sunlight, Sarah realized that her testimony had accomplished something she hadn't expected. It had defined her not as someone who used power to settle scores, but as someone who used power to serve principles larger than personal advancement. The crisis was over, but the real test of leadership was just beginning. 3 months later, Sarah Mitchell stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her new corner office on the 43rd floor, watching the morning sun paint Manhattan's financial district in shades of gold and possibility. The nameplate on her door read Senior Vice President, Risk Management and Crisis Resolution, a position that hadn't existed before the breach, but had been created specifically to institutionalize the competence she'd demonstrated during Sterling and Associates' darkest hour. The transformation had been remarkable. What began as a catastrophic data breach had evolved into the most comprehensive organizational reform in the firm's history. The regulatory investigators had commended Sterling and Associates for its transparent response and systematic improvements, turning potential disgrace into industry recognition for crisis management excellence. Sarah's office reflected her new reality: 3 monitors displaying real-time security metrics, client confidence indices, and regulatory compliance dashboards. But more importantly, it represented something she'd never imagined possible: institutional recognition that competence and integrity could triumph over politics and prejudice when the stakes were high enough. A soft knock interrupted her morning review of security protocols. Tom Bradley entered, carrying a tablet and wearing the confident expression of someone who'd grown from naive observer to principled analyst in just 3 months. "Morning, Sarah. The quarterly security assessment is complete. All vulnerabilities addressed, all protocols verified, all client communications transparent and accurate." Sarah smiled, remembering the uncertain young man who'd approached her cubicle with disturbing evidence about institutional failures. Tom's moral courage during the crisis had earned him promotion to senior risk analyst, and his systematic approach to preventing future crises had become a model for the entire industry. "Any concerns?" Sarah asked, reviewing his comprehensive report. "None technical, but I wanted to discuss the Harvard Business Review article. They're calling our crisis response the Sterling model for transparent institutional reform. The requests for consulting engagements are overwhelming." Sarah nodded, still adjusting to her role as an industry expert whose crisis management approach was being studied and replicated across the financial sector. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same competence that had been dismissed and marginalized was now being celebrated and exported. David Park appeared in her doorway, his security director badge reflecting his own advancement within the reformed organization. Their professional partnership had deepened into something more personal over the past months, built on mutual respect and shared values that had sustained them through the crisis. "Elena wants to see you," David said, his expression suggesting good news. "She has something to discuss about the future." Sarah made her way to Elena Rodriguez's office, passing the bustling trading floor where hundreds of employees worked with the confidence that came from knowing their institution prioritized substance over appearances, competence over connections. Elena's office commanded a view of the harbor, and her expression showed the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully navigated institutional transformation while preserving everything worth preserving. "Sarah, sit down." I have news that will interest you. Sarah settled into the familiar chair, where 3 months earlier, she'd received official authority to solve a crisis that had threatened to destroy everything. The board has asked me to extend my retirement by 2 years to oversee our expansion into international markets, Elena began. But I've declined. I believe Sterling and Associates needs fresh leadership that represents the values we've discovered during this crisis. Sarah felt her pulse quicken, sensing the implications. I'm recommending you for promotion to Chief Operating Officer, Elena continued. The board has already approved the recommendation unanimously. You'd be the youngest COO in the firm's history, and the first woman to hold the position. The magnitude of the offer settled over Sarah slowly. 3 months ago, she'd been relegated to a cubicle, dismissed by superiors who questioned her ability to handle pressure. Now she was being offered the opportunity to lead an institution of thousands, managing billions in assets for the very pension funds she'd worked so hard to protect. Elena, I'm honored, but I need to ask, what happened to Marcus? Elena's expression grew thoughtful. Marcus accepted a position with a smaller firm in Chicago. He's rebuilding his career with the understanding that competence matters more than connections. Interestingly, he specifically requested training in the crisis management protocols you developed. Sarah smiled, recognizing justice served through transformation rather than destruction. There's one condition, Elena added. I want you to institutionalize the lessons we've learned, create training programs, mentorship initiatives, and advancement criteria that ensure competence and integrity define leadership rather than politics and prejudice. That's not a condition, Sarah replied. That's the point. Standing at Elena's window, looking out over the city where her career had almost been destroyed by the very prejudices she was now positioned to eliminate, Sarah felt the weight of possibility. The crisis that had threatened everything had ultimately revealed the institution's capacity for transformation when led by people who valued substance over appearance. Her phone buzzed with a text from her parents in Ohio. Saw the Wall Street Journal article. So proud of our daughter who never gave up. Sarah Mitchell had spent 5 years proving she belonged in corporate finance. Now she had the opportunity to ensure that no one else would have to prove it quite so dramatically. The real work was just beginning, but for the first time in her career, she was building rather than just surviving. Outside her window, the city hummed with the energy of endless possibility, and Sarah finally felt ready to shape that possibility rather than simply endure it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. 5 years after that pivotal morning when Sarah Mitchell discovered the data breach that would transform her career and Sterling and Associates, she stood in the boardroom of the newly renamed Sterling Mitchell Financial Group, looking out at the Manhattan skyline that had witnessed her journey from marginalized analyst to industry leader. The panoramic view from the 52nd floor encompassed not just the financial district, but the broader transformation that had rippled through the entire sector. The company had grown from a mid-sized investment firm managing $12 billion in assets to a premier financial institution overseeing $47 billion, with offices in New York, London, Tokyo, and São Paulo. But the numbers that mattered most to Sarah weren't on any financial statement. They were the metrics that measured the cultural revolution she had helped orchestrate across the industry. The quarterly diversity and inclusion report is remarkable, announced Dr. Patricia Williams, Sterling Mitchell's chief diversity officer and former Harvard Business School professor who had joined the firm 2 years earlier. We now have gender parity across all management levels. Our pay equity audit shows 0 statistical variance, and our employee satisfaction scores continue to rank in the top 5% industry-wide. Sarah nodded, but her attention was focused on the deeper implications of those statistics. Each percentage point represented individual careers that had been nurtured rather than marginalized, talented professionals who had been promoted based on merit rather than politics, and workplace cultures that valued competence over connections. What about the mentorship program statistics? Sarah asked, referring to the initiative that had become her signature contribution to industry transformation. The Sterling Foundation for Professional Excellence has now placed over 3,000 mid-career professionals in leadership roles across 470 financial institutions worldwide, Dr. Williams replied, consulting her tablet. The program has achieved a 94% success rate in preventing gender-based career stagnation, and participants show 37% higher advancement rates compared to industry averages. The Sterling Foundation had emerged from Sarah's recognition that her own experience of overcoming institutional prejudice wasn't unique. Countless talented professionals faced similar barriers that wasted human capital while weakening organizational performance. What started as an internal mentorship program had evolved into a comprehensive initiative that provided career development, leadership training, and advancement support for professionals who had been overlooked or marginalized by traditional corporate structures. Tom Bradley entered the boardroom carrying a stack of files and wearing the confident expression of someone who had grown from junior analyst to senior vice president of risk assessment. His transformation paralleled the company's evolution, from someone who quietly documented problems to a leader who proactively prevented them. Sarah, the Federal Reserve wants to discuss adopting our crisis management framework as an industry standard, Tom said, settling into a chair at the polished conference table. They're particularly interested in the transparency protocols and the systematic approach to institutional accountability. The invitation represented vindication on a scale Sarah had never imagined. The crisis management methodology she had developed during that desperate morning 5 years earlier, born from necessity and moral clarity rather than theoretical knowledge, had become a model studied by regulatory agencies and implemented by financial institutions worldwide. There's more, Tom continued, opening one of his files. The European Central Bank is requesting consultation on implementing similar frameworks across EU financial markets. They want to understand how transparency and competence-based leadership can enhance systemic stability. Sarah reflected on the irony that her approach to crisis management, once dismissed as naive idealism by Marcus Sterling, was now being embraced by the most sophisticated financial regulators in the world. The lesson was clear. Principles weren't obstacles to success. They were foundations for sustainable achievement. David Park appeared in the doorway, his Chief Technology Officer badge reflecting the trajectory that had taken him from internal ally to industry innovator. Over the past 5 years, their professional partnership had deepened into marriage, built on shared values and mutual respect that had sustained them through both triumph and challenge. The Cybersecurity Conference in Geneva wants you to deliver the keynote address, David said, approaching with his laptop open to display an official invitation. They're calling it From Crisis to Leadership, Building Resilient Financial Systems Through Ethical Management. The invitation reminded Sarah of how far they had traveled from that morning when she had been relegated to support activities, while men debated solutions they couldn't implement. Now she was being recognized as a thought leader whose insights shaped policy at the highest levels of international finance. There's something else, David added, his expression mixing excitement. With anticipation, Elena Rodriguez called. She wants to discuss a proposal that could change everything. Elena Rodriguez had become more than a mentor over the past 5 years. She had evolved into Sarah's closest advisor and the architect of many of the industry-wide changes that had followed Sterling Associates' transformation. Now serving as chair of the Federal Reserve's Committee on Financial Institution Governance, Elena wielded influence that extended far beyond any single company. She'll be here in an hour, David continued, but she mentioned something about a presidential appointment and financial system reform. I think you should prepare for a conversation that could define the next phase of your career. As David and Tom left to prepare for the afternoon meetings, Sarah found herself alone in the boardroom, surrounded by the trappings of success, but focused on the deeper questions of purpose and impact. The corner office, the industry recognition, the financial security, all of it had exceeded her most ambitious dreams from 5 years earlier. But the most meaningful transformation wasn't professional, it was personal. The bitter anger that had initially fueled her determination to prove Marcus Sterling wrong had evolved into something more constructive, a commitment to building systems that prevented others from experiencing the institutional prejudice she had endured. Revenge had been a powerful motivator for overcoming adversity, but building lasting change required moving beyond personal grievances to address systemic problems. Her assistant knocked on the boardroom door, carrying an urgent message that interrupted Sarah's reflection. "Ms. Mitchell, you have a call from Senator Elizabeth Warren's office. They're requesting a meeting to discuss financial services reform legislation." The call represented another milestone in Sarah's unexpected journey from crisis manager to policy influencer. Her testimony before congressional committees had helped shape legislation requiring transparency in financial institution governance, establishing protection for whistleblowers who reported institutional negligence, and mandating diversity and inclusion metrics in regulatory evaluations. "Schedule the meeting for next week," Sarah replied, "and make sure Tom and David are available to participate. This affects all of our initiatives." As her assistant departed, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from an unexpected source: Marcus Sterling himself. Despite their contentious history, Marcus had gradually transformed from adversary to occasional correspondent, his messages offering updates on his own journey of professional and personal growth. "Saw the news about your Federal Reserve consultation work," his message read. "Wanted you to know that the crisis management protocols you developed have become standard practice at our firm. You probably saved more careers and companies than you'll ever know. Thank you for choosing principles over revenge." Sarah smiled, recognizing the sincerity behind words that would have been impossible to imagine 5 years earlier. Marcus's transformation from entitled executive to thoughtful leader demonstrated that institutional change was possible even among those who had initially resisted it most strongly. His consulting practice now specialized in helping financial firms implement ethical leadership frameworks and overcome the cultural barriers that prevented talented professionals from advancing based on merit. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that the man who had once dismissed her competence was now advocating for the very principles he had originally opposed. Elena Rodriguez arrived precisely on schedule, her silver hair now completely white, but her strategic acumen as sharp as ever. She carried herself with the confidence of someone whose career had spanned multiple decades of financial industry evolution, witnessing firsthand how individual acts of courage could catalyze institutional transformation. "Sarah, I hope you're prepared for a conversation that could change not just your career, but the entire financial regulatory landscape," Elena said, settling into the chair across from Sarah at the conference table. "I'm listening." "President Harris wants to nominate you for a newly created position, Director of Financial Institution Ethics and Accountability. It would be a cabinet-level appointment with authority to investigate institutional negligence, implement industry-wide reform initiatives, and ensure that financial firms prioritize fiduciary responsibility over short-term profits." The magnitude of the offer settled over Sarah slowly. 5 years earlier, she had been a junior analyst whose warnings about security vulnerabilities were dismissed by executives who valued connections over competence. Now she was being offered the opportunity to shape regulatory policy for the entire financial sector. "The position would require Senate confirmation," Elena continued, "but preliminary discussions suggest bipartisan support. Your track record of transparent crisis management and institutional reform has impressed legislators from both parties." Sarah considered the implications. Accepting the appointment would mean leaving Sterling Mitchell Financial Group, the company she had helped transform and the team she had built. But it would also provide a platform for implementing the principles she had championed on a scale that could affect millions of Americans whose financial security depended on institutional competence and ethical leadership. "There's something else?" Elena added, her expression growing more serious. The position comes with investigative authority that could expose negligence and fraud across the financial sector. You'd be making powerful enemies among institutions that profit from opacity and lack of accountability. I've made powerful enemies before, Sarah replied, thinking of the board members and executives who had initially opposed her reforms. The question is whether the position would allow me to build something better, not just tear down what's broken. Elena smiled, the expression of a mentor who recognized that her student had learned the most important lesson about leadership. That's exactly why you're the right person for the job. You understand that sustainable change comes from building institutions that serve broader purposes, not from destroying those who oppose reform. Their conversation was interrupted by Tom Bradley, who appeared with urgent news about a developing crisis at a major investment bank. Sarah, we're getting reports of potential insider trading and client fund mismanagement at Goldman Sachs. The SEC is requesting consultation on investigation protocols and crisis management strategies. The request reminded Sarah that her expertise in crisis resolution had become a valuable resource for regulatory agencies attempting to navigate increasingly complex financial scandals. Her approach, emphasizing transparency, accountability, and systematic reform rather than superficial damage control, had proven effective in maintaining market stability while ensuring appropriate consequences for institutional failures. Schedule. A briefing for tomorrow morning, Sarah instructed, and invite David to provide technical analysis of any cybersecurity implications. As Tom departed to coordinate the consultation, Elena returned to their discussion of the presidential appointment. The Goldman Sachs situation illustrates exactly why this position is necessary. The financial sector needs independent oversight that prioritizes institutional integrity over political convenience. Sarah understood the broader context. Despite the reforms that had followed the 2008 financial crisis, many institutions continued to prioritize short-term profits over long-term stability, relying on government bailouts rather than prudent risk management. The position Elena described would provide authority to address these systemic problems before they threatened economic stability. What's the timeline for a decision? Sarah asked. The president wants an answer within 2 weeks. She's planning to announce the appointment as part of a broader financial reform initiative that would establish new standards for institutional accountability. After Elena departed, Sarah found herself walking through the offices of Sterling Mitchell Financial Group, observing the workplace culture she had helped create. The open floor plan fostered collaboration rather than hierarchy, with experienced professionals mentoring junior staff regardless of gender or background. Conference rooms buzzed with diverse teams working on complex problems, their discussions focused on client outcomes rather than internal politics. The trading floor reflected the company's commitment to transparency and ethical practices. Real-time monitoring systems tracked not just financial performance, but compliance metrics, ensuring that profit-seeking never compromised fiduciary responsibilities. Digital displays showed client satisfaction scores, employee engagement statistics, and community impact measurements, metrics that captured the company's broader purpose beyond financial returns. In the break room, Sarah encountered several employees whose careers had been transformed by the company's inclusive culture. Maria Santos, a former administrative assistant who had earned her CFA designation through the company's education support program, was now a senior portfolio manager overseeing institutional accounts. James Chen, who had joined as a junior analyst, after being passed over for promotion at his previous firm due to subtle age discrimination, had become a respected team leader whose expertise was valued rather than marginalized. Sarah, I wanted to thank you again for the leadership development program, Maria said, approaching with a coffee cup and a warm smile. Without the company's support for continuing education, I never would have had the opportunity to advance into portfolio management. You earned the promotion through competence and dedication, Sarah replied. The company just provided the framework for your talents to be recognized and developed. The conversation reminded Sarah of why the Sterling Foundation's mentorship initiatives had become so successful. They didn't create talent. They removed the barriers that prevented existing talent from flourishing. By establishing systematic approaches to career development that emphasized merit over demographics, the programs had unlocked human potential that had been wasted by less enlightened institutions. Returning to her office, Sarah found David reviewing cybersecurity protocols for the Goldman Sachs consultation. His technical expertise had evolved beyond traditional IT security to encompass the broader intersection of technology and institutional ethics, making him a sought-after advisor for firms attempting to implement comprehensive reform initiatives. The Goldman Sachs situation looks more complex than initial reports suggested, David said, looking up from his laptop. The insider trading appears to be connected to systematic data mining of client communications, possibly involving artificial intelligence algorithms that identified profitable information in confidential correspondence. The revelation highlighted the evolving challenges facing financial regulators. Traditional approaches to oversight had been designed for conventional forms of fraud and negligence, but emerging technologies created new opportunities for sophisticated misconduct that existing frameworks couldn't adequately address. This is exactly the kind of challenge the presidential appointment would tackle, Sarah observed. Developing regulatory frameworks that can keep pace with technological innovation while maintaining institutional accountability. David nodded, understanding the broader implications. The position would let you influence policy at the highest levels, but it would also put you at the center of political battles over financial regulation. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny and opposition? Sarah considered the question seriously. Her transformation from marginalized analyst to industry leader had required navigating complex political dynamics, but always within the relatively contained environment of corporate finance. A presidential appointment would expose her to congressional hearings, media attention, and lobbying pressure from powerful interests that profited from regulatory weakness. "I've learned that avoiding difficult battles doesn't make them disappear," she replied. "It just ensures that problems get worse until someone with courage decides to address them." Her phone rang with a call from an unexpected source. Margaret Whitfield, CEO of Teachers' Retirement System, and one of the clients whose assets Sarah had protected during the Sterling Associates crisis 5 years earlier. Their professional relationship had evolved into mutual respect and occasional collaboration. On industry initiatives, "Sarah, I'm calling about rumors of your potential appointment to the new federal position," Margaret said without preamble. "I wanted you to know that institutional investors managing pension funds are unanimously supportive. Your approach to crisis management saved billions in retirement assets, and we need that same competence applied to regulatory oversight." The endorsement carried significant weight. Pension fund managers represented the interests of millions of teachers, nurses, firefighters, and other public servants whose financial security depended on institutional competence and ethical leadership. Their support suggested that Sarah's appointment would serve broader public interests rather than narrow political agendas. "There's something else," Margaret continued. "We've been discussing the possibility of establishing an industry consortium focused on ethical investment practices and institutional accountability. Would Sterling Mitchell be interested in taking a leadership role?" The proposal aligned perfectly with Sarah's vision of using financial sector influence to promote positive social outcomes. Rather than viewing profits and principles as competing priorities, the consortium would demonstrate that ethical practices enhanced rather than hindered long-term financial performance. "Absolutely," Sarah replied. "Send me the preliminary framework, and we'll provide detailed feedback within the week." As the afternoon progressed, Sarah found herself reviewing the journey that had brought her to this crossroads. The data breach that had threatened to destroy her career had instead revealed her true potential, demonstrating that adversity could unlock capabilities that comfort never developed. The institutional prejudice that had marginalized her contributions had ultimately motivated her to build more inclusive systems that benefited countless other professionals. but perhaps most importantly, the choice to prioritize principles over revenge had established her reputation as someone who could be trusted with power. The regulatory position Elena had described required not just technical competence, but moral authority. The confidence of market participants that decisions would be made based on evidence and ethics rather than political considerations. Tom, Bradley returned with updates on the Goldman Sachs consultation, carrying documents that revealed the scope of the alleged misconduct. Sarah, this is bigger than we initially thought. The artificial intelligence system they developed wasn't just analyzing client communications. It was predicting market movements based on confidential information from multiple sources. The revelation highlighted the sophisticated nature of modern financial fraud. Traditional regulatory approaches that focused on individual transactions or isolated incidents were inadequate for addressing systematic misconduct that leveraged advanced technology to exploit information asymmetries. On an unprecedented scale, we need to brief the SEC on the technological implications, Sarah said, recognizing that the consultation would provide valuable insights for her decision about the presidential appointment. This case could establish precedents for how regulators address AI-enabled financial crimes. As evening approached and the Manhattan office towers began to glow with interior lights, Sarah found herself standing once again at her office windows, contemplating the decision that would define the next phase of her career. The view encompassed not just the financial district, but the broader city, whose economic well-being depended on institutional competence and ethical leadership. The presidential appointment would require sacrificing the company she had helped build and the team she had assembled, but it would provide an opportunity to implement the principles she had championed on a scale that could affect the entire financial system. The choice wasn't between success and failure. It was between different forms of service to ideals that transcended personal advancement. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her parents in Ohio. Saw the news reports about your potential appointment. Whatever you decide, we're proud of the person you've become and the principles you've demonstrated. The message reminded Sarah of the values that had sustained her through 5 years of transformation. Her parents had taught her that true success was measured not by personal achievement, but by contribution to something larger than oneself. The financial security and professional recognition she had achieved were meaningful, but they were means to an end rather than ultimate goals. David appeared in her doorway, carrying dinner from their favorite restaurant and wearing the understanding expression of someone who recognized the weight of the decision she faced. "I thought you might be too busy to eat," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "Thank you," Sarah replied, realizing she hadn't eaten since breakfast. "What's your honest assessment of the appointment? Not as my husband, but as someone who understands the technical and political complexities involved." David considered the question carefully, his analytical nature evident in his measured response. The position would let you influence policy in ways that could prevent the kind of institutional negligence that created the Sterling Associates crisis. But it would also put you at the center of political battles where competence and integrity don't always prevail. And personally? Personally, I think you're one of the few people with both the technical expertise and moral authority to make the position effective rather than ceremonial. The financial sector needs someone who can't be intimidated or corrupted, someone whose track record proves that principles and pragmatism can coexist. Their conversation was interrupted by Elena Rodriguez, who returned with additional information about the appointment. "Sarah, I just spoke with the president's chief of staff. They want to accelerate the timeline, a decision by the end of this week, an announcement early next week if you accept." The compressed schedule reflected the urgency of financial sector, challenges that couldn't wait for lengthy deliberations. Recent market volatility, emerging cybersecurity threats, and increasing evidence of institutional misconduct had created conditions that demanded immediate action from leaders who could navigate complexity while maintaining public confidence. "There's one more thing," Elena added. The president wants to establish a comprehensive financial reform initiative that would include new legislation, regulatory frameworks, and enforcement mechanisms. Your appointment would be the cornerstone of that effort, but it would also make you a target for every special interest that profits from the status quo. Sarah understood the implications. Accepting the appointment would mean accepting responsibility for outcomes that extended far beyond her individual capabilities, while facing opposition from some of the most powerful institutions in the American economy. But it would also provide an opportunity to build systems that prevented other talented professionals from facing the institutional barriers she had overcome. "I need to discuss this with my team," Sarah said, recognizing that her decision would affect not just her own career, but the future of Sterling Mitchell Financial Group and the hundreds of employees whose livelihoods depended on the company's continued success. "Of course," Elena replied. "But remember that some opportunities only come once. The political alignment that makes this appointment possible might not exist again for years." As Elena departed, Sarah found herself alone with David in the office that had become both symbol and instrument of her transformation from marginalized analyst to industry leader. The decision she faced represented more than a career choice. It was a test of the principles she had articulated and the values she had championed. "What does your instinct tell you?" David asked, recognizing that technical analysis could only inform decisions that ultimately required moral clarity. Sarah stood and walked to the windows overlooking the financial district where her career had nearly been destroyed by institutional prejudice. The same city that had once seemed hostile to her ambitions now offered the opportunity to shape policy that could affect millions of Americans whose financial security depended on institutional competence and ethical leadership. "My instinct tells me that I didn't overcome 5 years of institutional barriers just to become comfortable," she replied. "I learned that competence without courage is meaningless, and that principles without power can't create change." David smiled, recognizing the determination that had first attracted him to Sarah during their collaboration on crisis management 5 years earlier. "Then I think you already know what your answer will be." The next morning, Sarah called Elena Rodriguez to accept the presidential appointment, beginning a new chapter in her journey from crisis manager to policy architect. The decision represented not an ending, but a continuation of the transformation that had begun in a cubicle at Sterling Associates, where a marginalized analyst had chosen competence over compliance and principles over politics. 3 weeks later, Sarah Mitchell stood in the Rose Garden of the White House, raising her right hand to take the oath of office as the first director of Financial Institution Ethics and Accountability. The ceremony was attended by congressional leaders, federal regulators, and representatives from financial institutions across the country, many of whom she would now oversee and investigate. President Harris introduced Sarah as a leader whose track record proves that transparency and accountability enhance rather than hinder financial sector performance, emphasizing that the new position represented a commitment to preventing institutional negligence before it threatened economic stability. As Sarah recited the oath of office, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, from discovering a data breach at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning to accepting responsibility for ethical oversight of the entire financial sector. The transformation had required courage, competence, and the conviction that principles mattered more than personal comfort. But most importantly, it had required the recognition that true success was measured not by individual achievement but by contribution to institutions that served purposes larger than profit. The young analyst who had been dismissed as incapable of handling pressure had become a leader entrusted with protecting the financial security of millions of Americans. Standing in the Rose Garden with her hand raised in solemn commitment to uphold the Constitution and serve the public interest, Sarah Mitchell understood that her greatest accomplishment wasn't personal. It was proving that competence and integrity could triumph over prejudice and politics when leaders had the courage to choose principles over convenience. The real work was just beginning, but for the first time in her career, Sarah felt fully prepared to meet challenges that required not just technical expertise, but moral authority. The financial sector would be stronger because someone who understood both its potential and its pitfalls was now positioned to ensure that it served the American people rather than simply enriching the already powerful. 5 years after a crisis had threatened to end her career, Sarah Mitchell had transformed herself and her industry, proving that individual acts of courage could create institutional change when guided by principles larger than personal advancement. The future belonged to those who understood that true disruption came not from breaking things, but from building them better. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.